Hey everyone, and welcome to episode 3 of my scratch build for the Great Guitar Build Off 2023. This is my Revstar inspired build. And let's start off this episode by working on the top. So when I left off in the last episode, I had jointed and glued it. So here I am, just taking the sander to it to clean off any excess glue and level it up a little bit. Here I'm using my templates to figure out where the body needs to go, as well as the cavity covered plates. And here you can see me cutting it out. I like to use coping saws or jeweler's saws like this for this kind of operation. I feel it's a lot more accurate, doesn't take very long, and I'm just more comfortable using hand tools generally, really. I also wanted to save as much of the material at the top here for doing the cavity cover plates, and I felt doing it this way would do that. So next let's look at making the fretboard. I used the CNC as per my prototype really. So here you can see a V-bit scoring the fret slot lines, which I then later went in and cut out with my crimson fret slotting saw. You can see it's already cut the fret marker slots. I forgot to film that, but you wouldn't have seen anything in a way with the dust shoe on. Here you can see it going around cutting out the profile. It's a pretty simple toolpath. I'm using a 1/4 of an inch compression bit in I think 2mm steps vertically, and it does a step in horizontally as well, leaving a finishing pass of like 0.2mm I think it was, and as you can see it leaves some tabs as well, although it's masking taped and super glued down in a way. And here you can see I've already cut the fret slots, and I'm mixing up some epoxy to fill the fret marker slots. So now we're going to look at making the neck on the CNC. So here I'm using my Radian Tools surfacing bit. Due to the safe limits on the CNC, I have to run it in this direction, which leaves some slight tool marks on there. This deeper area here is for the headstock. It's worth mentioning that whilst I was doing this neck, the extractor for the CNC wasn't working particularly well. So you see at certain points I'll be using the shop vac. Here I'm using a 1/4 of an inch flat end mill to run a profile around the full perimeter of the neck and down below the headstock thickness by about 4mm. The reason I do this at this early stage is to help with this toolpath that will remove the bulk of the material in the transition between the flat part of the headstock and the higher flat part of the neck. This here is using Fusion 360's 3D parallel toolpath, using a 1/4 of an inch flat end mill. And what this does is, because I'm running it in the longitudinal direction like that, when that end mill hits the curve there, it essentially starts acting like a bullnose end mill, and you get a nice smooth finish on there. So here I'm cutting out the slot for the truss rod. It runs full depth in about 3 or 4 different sections, or different pockets I guess in Fusion 360 speak. These slots either side are for the carbon fibre rods. This slot is for a inlay in the headstock of some maple and sapele binding. And here I'm back to using a 1/4 inch flat end mill. I think this is a compression bit that's boring out the holes for the tuners. And then back to finishing off the profile around the outside. And here's the finished result. I think it looks really good. I'm very happy with how it's turned out. And here I'm using this test I made of the neck pocket to see how it fits, which is pretty good. And here you can see me gluing in the sapele and maple binding strips that I'm using. So I went with 3 pieces of the binding, 2 maple and a sapele in the middle, which kind of the idea is to reflect the stripe on the body itself. Here you can see me using a flush cut saw to remove the bulk of the excess material. I was actually heading slightly off course here, so that's why I'm cutting down vertically there as well, and then readjusting myself. I tried a few different things on the end here, but in the end I just settled on using my Irasaki files. And if you haven't used one of these crimson sanding sticks, I highly recommend them. Going to be so useful when I get to carving the body and the neck. I also used my levelling beam here with some coarser sandpaper just to get it the bulk of the way there a bit quicker. And here's the result. I think it looks fantastic and is going to work really well with the stripe in the body. And speaking of the body, let's make a start on that. So here I'm using the surfacing bit again to take, I think it was 1mm passes, and I took a total of 3mm from each side. The way I set the toolpath up is that it was zeroed off at the top of the piece, and then I would just re-zero it and run it again basically as many times as I needed. I figured if I encountered some nice grain or something I could stop and take it off the other side. Once this was done, I used my templates to set out where the body would sit and used the bandsaw to make a space to cut it out, but unfortunately I couldn't film that, so yeah, this is the result. Here I'm drilling holes through the electronics cavity using this auger bit from Armeg. I really like this bit, it does a really good job, really fast. The idea here was to drill all the way through in several locations and then just use the jigsaw to join the dots and then run round with the router to clean it up later. I did the same for the switch cavity here. And here I'm using the same bit to hog out the bulk of the material for the wire slot in the middle there between the pickups. And I also used it to hog out the bulk of the material in the weight relief cavities. Unfortunately, the depth stop on this drill mate thing that I use is, well, worthless. So I mark it on the sides with a Sharpie and just have to pay a bit more attention when I'm doing drilling. And here you can see I've attached my template and I'm using the router to quickly run around both the electronics cavity and the switch cavity. So basically I'm setting the depth, running around both. Just saves a little bit of time doing it that way. And I've got to say I am really impressed with these templates. The alignment pins are just so useful. I think once you've used those, there's no chance you're ever wanting to go back to a non-alignment pin system. Here you can see I've taken off the template now and I'm just running the bearing on the cut I've already made. And here's the result. I had one little snafu on the right hand side there where the router jumped and nicked a bit into the template, but it's not going to be an issue, it will be covered by the cavity plate and the top. The hole you see here and on the other side I think is a wormhole that was not visible in the original top. Here you can see the template on the back and can see that that issue is not actually an issue. And back to drilling to hog out the material for the other weight relief cavity. These wire slots are a bit too small for that auger bit, so I'm just using a 6mm brad point. And here I'm using masking tape and super glue to attach my template. Technically I don't think I really need it with my alignment pins, but I just feel it's safer to ensure it doesn't pop up vertically off the pins. For routing the large cavities here, I'm using this guide bushing on my router. This allows me to very quickly pick a depth, run round all 3 cavities, then drop down another 4mm, run it again, etc, etc. It allows me to hog out the bulk of the material in a very efficient manner, and then I can simply run along with a bearing bit later on to finish it off. The guide bushing is too big for the 2 wire slots there, so that's why I'm not using it for those, but I do have a router bit that is small enough to get in there with a bearing, so I'll use that. And here's the result of all of that routing. And just for fun, here's the top sat on there. And I think that's about it for this episode. I shall see you in the next one.